So the respiratory system divided into upper and lower respiratory systems. And for all intents and purposes, in the lecture portion, we are foregoing any or much discussion on the upper respiratory system. Our focus is on the lower respiratory system. We don't care so much about the pharynx or the larynx, the voice box, the nose, the role of which is mostly to filter large particulate and start to moisten the air. We don't care about that so much. What I want to focus on is the lower respiratory system, and a brief schematic of which is shown here on the right-hand side. So from the trachea on down is the anatomy, or are the structures that I would like to focus on in our discussions in class. And some of these are going to be familiar. We don't know them in name or by name yet in class. We haven't talked about them, but you've seen them in lab. You know some of the names of these different airways and branches and the terminal endpoints of air in the lung. Lower respiratory system is primarily of emphasis. So all of this, lower respiratory system. But the lower respiratory system can be functionally divided, not just structurally, but functionally divided into conducting and respiratory zones. And you can see those bracketed over here on the right-hand side. The first part of the lower respiratory system is referred to as the conducting zone. Air is conducted. Air travels through this zone. Nothing else happens. Some stuff happens. We don't care about that other stuff. Air just moves through here until it gets to the point of interest, the respiratory zone, where gas exchange can occur. Gas exchange occurs in this respiratory zone, and all the structures that comprise this respiratory zone. That's where gas exchange occurs. So the upper respiratory system and the first half of the lower respiratory system simply serve the purpose of conducting air to the end of the airways where gas exchange occurs. So if you're paying attention, where does gas exchange occur? You could argue there are two answers, but one is more correct than the other. Where does gas exchange occur? Okay, that's what I was worried about. You're both technically right. The more correct answer is the respiratory zone of the lung. Exclusively it occurs there. But the respiratory zone of the lung is in the lower respiratory system. So not to worry, I've changed the marking for this question to accept both answers. These are both correct. D is more correct than B. I will also mention too, in keeping with all the other questions we've done, you still get a mark for answering. Answer anything, you still get a mark. Correct answers get 2. So that's still consistent from our previous quizzes. Just make sure you answer. Good. Gas exchange occurs in the respiratory zone. Now the overall tissue, the organ in which air is conveyed and where gas exchange occurs, you know, is the lung. The airways make up the lungs, and the lung tissue is shown here. These are paired organs within the body. And we've seen these already. These are the rest of the stuff that fills the thoracic cavity, other than the heart and the main structures in the mediastinum. So we've seen this already. The middle portion of this of these structures we saw, the mediastinum, the heart, and the rest of the thoracic cavity is filled by the lungs. So the right lung and the left lung. both shown here. We see some airways, we see them branch. We don't really know a lot of their names yet, but we do see the larynx at the top, or the voice box where the vocal cords are, and the trachea, which is the primary airway into the lungs. And you had some experience palpating a trachea in lab, and then seeing the slices of the trachea. And from this point on, it subdivides and subdivides into smaller and smaller structures. There are a few obvious differences when looking at the lung. They are generally the same shape, but there are some specifics that are a bit different. And one obvious difference is there's a divot cut out of the left lung. There's a bit of a concave depression in the left lung. We call the cardiac notch or the cardiac impression. And this is only due to the leftward rotation, the slight leftward rotation of the heart. The heart pushes into the left lung a little bit. And so the cardiac notch in the left lung accommodates the heart. And because of this little depression, the left lung is actually a little smaller than the right. Only about 10% smaller. But functionally, they still work as well. All the areas of the lung can still participate in gas exchange. There's no observable deficit in function. This is just a difference in structure that's noticeable. There's another fairly obvious difference in structure that we'll get back to when we circle around and address this in a bit more detail shortly. But overall, the lungs sit right on top of the diaphragm, enclosed in the thoracic cavity. One obvious difference is the cardiac impression, or the cardiac notch, making the left lung a little bit smaller. Now, like when we looked at the heart from an overall point of view, the lungs are encased in a double-walled membrane. Much like the pericardium that we saw that surrounds the heart, the lungs are surrounded by pleural and parietal layers as well to help reduce friction. So this is a true anatomy transverse slice looking up from the feet. So we're at the level of the heart through the arms. You can see the arm over here on the left with the humerus. We're through the heart. You can see the arch of the aorta. It would loop into the screen and then head back down towards the feet and the thoracic aorta coming out at you. And we can see the right lung on the left-hand side and the left lung on the right-hand side. Imagine the person's feet coming out of the screen at you. Notice how full the thoracic cavity is. The lungs almost take up the entire space. Mediastinum in the middle, large portion taken up by the lungs. And the double-walled membrane, you can't even really see, but the parietal pleura is the layer along the inside of the ribs. The visceral pleura, the complementary layer of that double-walled membrane, lines the lungs proper. So parietal pleura stuck to the inside of the ribs, and the visceral pleura is the fold over of that double-walled membrane that lines the actual tissue of the lung. Just like the visceral and parietal pericardium, double-walled membrane that create a small cavity, small space which is full of lubricating fluid that helps to reduce friction. The lungs move constantly, the heart moves constantly. And so to protect the lungs from rubbing on the inside of the rib cage and the intercostal muscles, this double-walled membrane contains some pleural fluid which helps to reduce friction. Constant inflation and deflation of the lungs otherwise would cause friction and perhaps damage. So we want to avoid that. You may have even seen some of this parietal pleura if you've ever had ribs before and you've noticed there's like a small tough layer on the underside of the ribs. Unfortunate, but true, that's parietal pleura. Not to offend any vegetarians or vegans in the crowd. So, the lungs take up a lot of the thoracic cavity. One obvious difference is the cardiac notch. And as we explore them in a bit more detail, notice there's a question coming up on the next slide. There are a few other features that separate the left from the right lung. Notice everything all told, the lungs sit in close proximity to the rib cage, and like the heart, the apex refers to the pointy bit, the base refers to the flat bit of the lung, but the orientation is reversed. Here the apex is at the top, and the base of the lung is at the bottom. Just a reverse orientation to the apex and the base of the heart. And you can see in the left-hand figure the extension of the pleura, the actual membranes, and the pleural cavity, the space between the membranes, extending a bit inferior to the base of the lung. It folds over and wraps around the top of the diaphragm as well, because the diaphragm is the main muscle involved in normal passive breathing. It's always contracting and lowering and rebounding. And so the pleural cavity surrounds the top of the diaphragm as well to help reduce friction between the diaphragm and the lungs. So you can see that hanging down a little bit below the 6th or 7th rib in that picture. Now in this view, there's not a whole lot that we can see that's different. If we take the ribs away and look at the lungs, it's fairly obvious. One of them has more, there are more lobes in the right lung than the left. There are both an oblique and a horizontal fissure in the right lung, whereas the left lung only has an oblique fissure. And what that does is separate that tissue into what we call lobes. And does that matter? Functionally, it doesn't really matter. The total tissue, the volume of tissue, is really what dictates the functional capacity of the lung. How many terminal endpoints are there? How many sites for gas exchange are there? That's what we care about. The number of lobes we don't really care about. But the number of lobes does affect the number of secondary bronchi, or secondary airways, divisions, as those airways progress into the lungs. So being that the right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2, if you were to follow those airways along, you'd see 3 secondary bronchi in the right lung and only 2 in the left. And that's about the end of where we care to count the number of airways. You'll see shortly how that number gets quite large quite quickly and very difficult to count. But you could observe a difference in the number of secondary bronchi if you so cared. Other defining structures of the lungs, not that these are very different, but if we look at the medial view, the portion abutting the mediastinum within the thoracic cavity, you'll notice a special structure on both lungs called the hilum, or the root of the lungs. And this is a special structure that allows passage of all vessels. The airways, the primary bronchi in this case, the pulmonary arteries bringing deoxygenated blood in to be oxygenated, and the pulmonary veins returning oxygenated blood back to the left heart. All of those structures pass through the hilum of the lung. You can see that just highlighted here in these purple squares. Now it's convenient to see them color-coded here. You see the orangey yellow that represents the bronchi, the blue for the pulmonary arteries, the red for the pulmonary veins. In practice, they don't look as nice as they do here. The organization is generally pretty similar, but it's a bit harder to distinguish them in real life. So, if you're paying attention, how many lobes are in the left lung? Not meant to be difficult. How many lobes are in the left lung? I could have asked how many secondary bronchi are in the left lung. That would have been a bit more difficult. Absolutely. 2 lobes in the left lung. Everyone is paying attention. Fantastic. Good, good, good. So let's make our way in. And I'm realizing now, I didn't mention, but I changed the order of some of the slides if you're looking online, because I thought it was easier to go from the outside at the tissue level and work our way in. So if we were a molecule of air working our way in, the first part of the lower respiratory system we would encounter is the trachea. Primary large airway in the lung, and you've seen this in lab. Generally concentric rings of cartilage that are not continuous. They are broken at the posterior side by the trachealis muscle, which allows expansion of the trachea or allows boluses of food to move down in the esophagus, which you can see here in close proximity, just posterior to the trachea. Not a whole lot to see here. One large airway that supplies the lungs with a volume of air. But as we travel through the trachea and then get into smaller and smaller airways, the first division, I mentioned it already and you knew before coming here, are the primary bronchi. There are only 2, one for each of the lungs, right at about the 5th thoracic vertebrae. Trachea bifurcates. It divides and then enters the lung as left and right primary bronchi. Also shown on this segment as main bronchi. And pretend the animations are working properly. So left and right main bronchi, there are only 2, one for each lung. Then the next division, well, I really didn't get that right. The next division are for the secondary bronchi, which match the number of lobes. So you know there are 3 in the right lung and 2 in the left. The other name for the secondary bronchi are the lobar bronchi. Lobar bronchi indicating bronchi that supply the lobes. The name indicates where the airway is headed. 3 lobes in the right lung, 2 in the left, so 3 lobar bronchi in the right, 2 lobar bronchi in the left. And then divisions proceed. We have tertiary bronchi that end with bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, and that's the end of the conduction zone of the lung, the conduction zone of the lower respiratory system. These structures all concern themselves with the transmission of air only, which should agree with your knowledge coming into class. Nothing new. I find it's nice to give a bit of context. It's easy to count bronchi, and it's easy to understand the number of secondary bronchi. We know there are subdivisions upon subdivisions, and the airways scatter as they enter the lungs. I want to say these are innumerable, but they are numerable. The numbers are significant. They're quite impactful. The context here is quite large. So, if every division results in 2 new branches, like for instance the trachea, when it divides, we get 2 primary bronchi. if they then divided into two airways, and then those divided into two airways, and so on and so forth, to appreciate the amount of branching in the lung, we can consider, okay, so the first generation, the first split, is 2 to the power of 1, meaning there are 2 primary bronchi. As we reach the end of the conducting zone, there have been 16 divisions. Doesn't sound like very much. There's been 16 divisions and they each branch into 2 airways. That's what? 32. 2 to the power of 16 is 65,000 terminal bronchioles. Every airway divides into 2 branches. And this is best case scenario. Some of them divide into 3. 2 to the power of 16 means 65,000 terminal bronchioles. And at this point, we're only halfway into the lung. This is the end of the conducting zone only. I wonder how many alveolar sacs there are going to be at generation number 23. So we are at the end of the conducting zone. We've concerned ourselves with transmission of air. Not much fun has happened yet. No gas exchange. The job of the lungs being to exchange gases. Turns our attention on here in the respiratory zone. This is where we really want to pay attention. This is where all the cool stuff happens. The physiology of the lungs come into play. As soon as the conducting zone ends, the terminal bronchioles give way to respiratory bronchioles, and then the other structures that are involved in gas exchange. Now, I don't want to gloss over the important structures. Yes, respiratory bronchioles can be involved in gas exchange. Yes, alveolar ducts can be involved in gas exchange. But by far, the most important structure involved in gas exchange are the alveoli, the individual small buds that make up the alveolar sacs. They have the largest surface area. That is the most opportunity for gas exchange. The largest number of sites for gas exchange. And they have the thinnest membranes, which means the least impediment to the movement of O2 and CO2. So yes, these other structures can be involved in gas exchange, but they don't have as large a surface area or as thin a membrane as the individual alveoli. Those are 2 of the 3 primary reasons that gas exchange occurs, period. Large surface area and thin membranes. If you're doing the math, after 23 divisions, every airway splitting into 2, there are 8.4 million alveolar sacs. 8.4 million alveolar sacs. We'll come back to this in a second, but if this is an alveolar sac, each of these individual bubbles is 1 alveolus. There might be, what, 20 per alveolar sac? I didn't do the math on how many alveoli there might be in the lungs, but many more than 8.4 million, put it that way. So respiratory zone, yes, the respiratory bronchioles can exchange gas, the alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs. The individual alveoli are by far the most important area for gas exchange. So with that in mind, we can approach this next question. Which structure is not involved in gas exchange? What structure is not involved in gas exchange? Fantastic. Terminal bronchioles, absolutely. The end of the conducting zone. Did that work? Did you all get your answers in? Why not? Was it not loading? Let's pretend we don't know the answer. Those of you that answered should be able to resubmit, or no? What structure is not involved in gas exchange? Surprise. Okay, nice job. Everyone answered correctly. Good work. Terminal bronchioles, the end of the conducting system. Respiratory bronchioles are the start of the respiratory zone and the first structure that may or may not be involved in gas exchange. That can be, put it that way. So as we continue to subdivide, we're reaching the more important structures, the alveoli, which are imperceptible even under a microscope. You need electron scanning microscopes to really see them and appreciate them. You can see some of the sacs shown here on the right-hand side. They're analogous to a cluster of grapes. That's always the analogy that I thought, and I liked seeing that the book uses that analogy too. Analogous to a cluster of grapes. So each of the alveolar sacs is a cluster of grapes, and then one individual grape is the alveolus proper. And you can appreciate here, I think, the surface area, the capacity for gas exchange. All of the interior walls are sites where oxygen can move out of the alveolus into the blood, and CO2 can do the reverse. All of the walls, because they are in such close proximity to capillary beds. Like we saw in that large slide way back when we talked about capillaries in the lung. Like I wanted to show you today with the 3D anatomy app, but I forgot my iPad, so we'll do that tomorrow. And like you can see here, with the network of capillaries completely encapsulating the bunch of grapes that is the alveolar sac on the left-hand side. Extensive network, lots of area for gas exchange. Now let's explore what that might look like, and we'll end with this slide today. If we zoom in on one individual alveolus, this is where the good stuff happens. All the interesting gas exchange occurs here. So this is one grape, one alveolus, part of the alveolar sac, if you would expand and see more of the picture. The alveolus, like you learned in lab, is mostly made up of what I'm going to call type 1 cells, and I'm not going to really address these much anymore, but they are the meat of the wall of the alveolus. The tissue, the wall, the membrane is largely made up of these type 1 alveolar cells. And I'm only going through the trouble of differentiating type 1 from the next type because of their an interesting characteristic of the second type that we'll talk about later. But type 1 cells make up the tissue in the wall of the alveolus. Maybe 90-95% of the wall is due to type 1 cells. And that membrane, you can see here, look at how thin that membrane is. Zoomed in this far, it doesn't seem so thin, but on the large scale of things, it's almost imperceptible. Microns of thickness, and in very close proximity to red blood cells in the capillaries. You can see the red blood cells shown here, capillary on the left and capillary on the bottom. Lots of opportunity for gas exchange. Now zooming in, you can see the exchange actually happening in this inset rectangle. You know the layers of tissue, and I'm not going to test you on them, but I want you to appreciate the movement through these tissues across this little bit of fluid. This is some of the interstitial fluid in the interstitial space that surrounds the alveoli. And we have the obvious diffusion of O2 out, diffusion of CO2 in. Very small barrier to movement, lots of gas exchange occurring at each of these points where the capillaries meet the alveoli. Now I just want to point out before we leave, and I'll recap this tomorrow, the difference between type 1 and type 2. Type 2, far less frequent cells within the alveoli, but are very important for allowing the alveoli to function normally. And what I mean by that is not collapse. Not collapse. Due to the actions of these type 2 cells, as they secrete, see all the way down here, there's this dark purple lining that you can trace all the way around the inside of the alveolus. This is a special kind of fluid, including a molecule called surfactant, that prevents the collapse of the alveoli. And this is secreted by type 2 cells only. We'll come back to that detail and that information in class tomorrow. Got a cool little animation to show you more about it. The type 2 cells secrete surfactant. They prevent the alveoli from collapsing. That's important. See you tomorrow.